Yeah, this is, in some ways, this is sort of like the Matias Almeida experience compressed into a 14 or 15th month process instead of almost 4 years. So there are parallels in terms of the situations, but there was I would say this was a time of extremes. You had a really charismatic, fiery, go-getter type of coach. I don't know if he was as of this year, but last year when he started, he was the youngest head coach in the league by some margin. And he really reinvigorated the club and the fan base, coming in with a lot of charisma, big ideas about playing a sort of high tempo, breakneck, pedal to the metal pressing style, and really, had I would say sharp elbows in the sense of came in and immediately called out the entire roster really when he arrived for his first preseason. Made a real point of drilling fitness, of getting into the sort of minute details that you see with, for example, like Marcelo Bielsa, who's sort of one but not his only, I guess, ideological influence in terms of measuring players' body fat percentages. They spent somewhere in the low five figures on a DEXA machine to document and chart that in detail, and made it central to how players were evaluated and who got playing time and that sort of thing. And really was critical over the course of the first almost half of the season last year about fitness and the culture he wanted to build. And it was hard. I mean, it was hard work for the players. I think it ruffled a few feathers around the club, but there was a sense that was what was needed and worthwhile at a club that had Ben Olsen in charge for, over a decade or about a decade. And so, there was a lot of excitement, and the results early on were thrilling, and he got some big wins. But injuries really hammered them down the stretch last year. They tailed off, just missed out on a playoff spot, and then they were, had been in a sustained period of struggle. I believe they'd lost 4 or 5 straight in the league coming into this week's Open Cup game. And from what I understand, this was already taking shape. It wasn't official, but it was. There were rumblings about issues even going into yesterday's Open Cup game, and then everything, accelerated and hit official status in the last few hours here.
So you mentioned ruffling the feathers, but ruffling the feathers of the players, not the ones who make this decision. How do we get from, okay, you need to be in better shape to play my system, to this quickly saying, this guy is no longer a part of our club, and he's not the one that we spent a really long time studying, researching, and interviewing to select a year ago?
Yeah, and we should emphasize that. I think the coaching search ran for months after Ben Olsen's dismissal. Chad Ashton, who is now the interim, and it sounds very much like he will get a full season to prove himself, and I suspect be considered for the job on a permanent basis if things go well. He had turned things up in a positive direction down the stretch in 2020, though they still didn't quite make the playoffs then. But they took a long time, and after he was hired, it became clear that Losada I think he'd been recommended to them by a third party, or maybe he was even a headhunter of some kind. Was not in the initial wave of candidates, but really impressed the front office and the executives with the way he interviewed and his ideas, coming over from Belgium. And I think there's a lot of factors here and a lot of nuance. And so I don't want to, we're still going to be, I think, picking through this and learning inside tidbits for weeks and months to come. But he had, similar to Almeida, I think, a South American sensibility, and maybe European sensibility, you might say, of how the dynamics would work between himself, what he was saying in the media, what he was conveying to his players and sort of conveying in his actions, and then how that would relate to ownership, the rest of the decision-making board on or decision makers on the technical side, and where things would go. So he was very vocal, early on about the fitness issues and the sort of infrastructure and the way day-to-day operations would go at the club. And this was all happening, at a timely moment because they were moving into a new training facility, right. United Performance Center. And then he got really, really vocal, I guess throughout, but especially in the lead up to the start of this season about the squad. He wanted more investment. He was very particular to note in press availabilities, how much Toronto were spending, for example, how much other clubs in MLS were spending on signings, and felt that his team needed some of that to be competitive. And I suspect, and from what I'm hearing, again, this is, rumblings and off the record stuff, but I think there were personality clashes in there somewhere, fundamental disagreements, and some of it came to a head over roster decisions and selection decisions, even for the Open Cup game.
So who is making this call now? I guess my question is, like, who's left in terms of ownership down through Dave Casper and Lucy Rushton, of sort of who does this fall on? Because this adds the pressure to that group, who this was their coach, and now they've got to find another one. Like, what does it look like now going forward in terms of leadership for DC?
Yeah, so Dave Casper has been around for, I want to say somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 years or close to it. And he is, he's very well connected. He's shown an acumen for sort of the older school, I guess I would say, for lack of a better word, MLS type of transactions, and was very good at searching up values, winning trades, picking up undervalued assets and various league mechanisms, and doing deals. Lucy Rushton, who arrived, I think about a year and a week ago, came in from Atlanta United with a very data-centric approach. She's highly respected, has a really strong track record in both England and the United States of using data analysis to identify players, to find the right mix and get the most performance out of the roster. And so the idea was, it wasn't entirely clear how the three parties here, those two and Losada, would interact and what the power dynamics were. The idea was that you had a sort of troika of different kind of skill sets and perspectives there that could work together to build a roster catered to the high pressing, high tempo system that Losada wanted. So in the wake of this, I mean, Chad Ashton has been around for a long time as well. I think he dates back to maybe even the Tom Sohn era, back in the mid aughts. And he's, I don't know that how much he's going to change the tactics. I think probably things will be a little bit less hair on fire tempo, but he's not the type that's going to make drastic changes in that sense. But he'll be a steady hand on the till. He's seems to be really well liked and respected by the players. Chris Seitz, a former DC United player, actually reached out on Twitter about that this morning, about how much the players respect Ashton. And he's very much a contrast to Losada in terms of his personality. And it certainly sounds like he's going to get a long look and be given an opportunity to show what he can do with the squad that I think I will just say that the rest of the club thinks more of maybe than Losada did based on his public utterances.
So that's what we think we're going on the soccer side. Talk to me a little bit about the fan side right now, and just what have they seen from Losada? What's going to be the reaction in the market to a pretty drastic move?
Yeah, and I should also point out in the context of what we just said too, that there as I think is a factor in the San Jose situation, there's a lot of value, I think, to teams that make a change during this season to waiting to the end, because you're talking about a World Cup, that's ending in December, and conceivably a lot of potential candidates would be coming online in the wake of. I think that's kind of in the background to this too. Now, from a fan perspective, DC United has fallen off over the last decade or so from the high watermark of the early years, and longtime fans have a lot of frustration about that. They were excited, I think, and fan base in general was excited by Losada, his mentality, his tactics, and I think they identified with a lot of the overt and sort of less overt, criticisms or observations he made about the club and the way things had been sort of gotten a little stale. And so the early reaction I'm seeing is they're quizzical, curious about how this all broke down, and skeptical, because they want to see a deeper culture change in the organization to become more consistently competitive. And it's not about Ashton personally. I think it's more the idea of going back to someone who's been around for so long and who's already been an interim coach, rather than move forward, going all in on Losada. That said, the Losada's results really tailed off, and I think the real questions about his sort of ability to maintain the fitness and the health of his guys and keep consistent performances in the grind of MLS, because he was still adapting to from Belgium.
So let's do names, because it's the best part of this whole thing. We're just going to make stuff up. We have no idea. This is just sort of, I think, as two people who are in the soccer sphere, these are sort of the names I've heard around, and ones that maybe could be connected to DC, which you know better than me. You mentioned managers being potentially available. I do believe Oscar Pereira is in the last year of his contract in Orlando. That is one that's interesting. When I look through the league right now, there are not a lot of people that you'd say, you look at Cincinnati, Pat Noonan's not going anywhere if they perform poorly. So when you look towards the bottom of the standings, there aren't a lot of managers outside of maybe a Phil Neville who will be available, but there are a lot of names that I think can be connected. Charlie, my list starts with Lucha Gonzalez. Again, not a guy who will be available this year because he's going to go to a World Cup, but he's someone who wants to be a head coach, obviously has experience, makes a ton of sense. We already connected him with the San Jose job, whether he wants it or not. I think he goes in that conversation with Pareja. And then for me, everyone else is an assistant or a head coach at a lower division that could come in. Does anyone pop to you first before I rattle off a bunch of random names?
Well, our homie Matt Doyle over on Twitter today, I think, has put forward Hugo Perez's name. And I think off the bat, that makes a lot of sense. There are, he was rapidly connected to the Quakes job too. He has some Bay Area ties, but he also would have, I think, a number of different sort of points of appeal for DC United. The Salvadoran community in the country is one of the largest, or in this region is one of the largest in the country. It is one that the club has struggled, I would say, to connect with ever since the move to Audi Field. And it's a, I guess I would say, again, for certain members of the punditry and the fan base, it's one of those unknown unknowns in terms of, could you grow the relevance, the size of the attendance of everything if you can connect with that population better. And Hugo certainly would give you that option if he's ready to move on from his time in charge of the El Salvador national team. And I think, again, that there might be some similarities or some fluidity that you could link to what happened under Losada. And then I think, again, I'm intrigued to see how this year goes under Chad Ashton, because I think he's going to get serious consideration for the job on a permanent basis. And then after that, given the way there's this sort of, we see these trends ebb and flow in terms of how coaches and players are valued and signed and elevated in MLS, and the foreign manager trend that kind of heated up after Tata Martino's success seems to have cooled off, right? And now we're hearing a lot of emphasis of MLS experience. And so if DC United follows that trend, then I think you'll see a lot of the names that often get bandied about, some of those top assistants that can make a case for working within MLS. MLS's unique environment and the parameters. This is a club that has opened up the purse strings since the move to Audi Field with a couple of designated players, but it hasn't really blown it out on the level that, again, some members of the fan base think is deserving for a market of this size and I guess acumen and tradition.
Now, one of the things they have done is, it feels like, from, I'm just going to say, the early luck of Bill Hamid and Andy Nahart, it feels like the academy setup has now become fluid. Kevin Paredes, being sold, Griffin Yao in the team, Moses Nineman. So I would assume Ryan Martin will be in the conversation. He's head of Loudoun United now. He's been in the academy. He's been around now for 3 or 4 years. I would assume he's someone who gets a look because of that reason. And as you mentioned, having somewhat of a connection to DC, similar to Chad Ashton. There's 2 former head coaches that are current assistants that I think are going to get mentioned because they'll probably get interviews. That's Freddie Juarez now in Seattle and Mark Dos Santos in LAFC, who it depends on who you talk to on each day. I've got a lot of people who have come back around on Marc Dos Santos in my world and are telling me he got a bad rap in Vancouver. He built what Fanny was able to make the playoffs with. Other conversations, and obviously he's got experience around the league. Freddie Juarez. It felt like the lack of ownership at RSL was a big reason that he moved on. And then the other names I have are names I know Pa Mudaka interviewed when Hernan Losada got the job. He's obviously head coach now with North Texas SC. That's someone you'd expect to get another interview if he was already there and has even more experience, has won a championship with Pacific FC, now coaching back in the U.S. since then. I think Steve Ralston's a name that we'll hear, especially depending on how it goes in San Jose for him. Ante Razov was a finalist, I believe, for the Houston Dynamo, is obviously a big name in U.S. circles, as you mentioned. If you're looking in that direction, if you're not looking internationally, Dave Vandenberg is a person that I know a lot of people have been really excited about now under Bruce Arena. So there is a slight DC connection from a million years ago there as well. Charlie, anyone else pop to your mind besides those that I said, or does any of those sort of come up as one that would be especially interesting for DC?
I think those names will be in the conversation. A couple more to throw out. Richie Williams has deep DC ties. Now, he spent a lot of the last, whatever, decade or two as one of Bruce Arena's most trusted assistants. He's up with the Revs now. But he had come back here and was briefly involved in Loudoun United, the launch of the second team for DC, and again has his name rings out in terms of his accomplishments as a DC United player and his Virginia ties as well. So if and when he decides that he's ready to jump back on the head coaching roller coaster, then I think I would imagine he'll at the very least get an interview or two. And then a name that maybe is not going to be on everyone's list right away, but I think is one of the top young assistants, is Nolan Sheldon. He is a West Virginia native who spent, I think it was more than a decade or around a decade at United. He was involved in the academy. He was a first-team assistant. I believe most of at least the last part of Olsen's tenure, he was the first assistant, and he was running the training sessions. So he was, really the coach in the sense that Olsen was the manager. So he went through the French formation, program at that time as United's representative, and he's at Austin FC now. And I'm sure he's not. He would have his have a number of doors around the league open to him when he wants to throw his hat into the ring for first team vacancies. But I would think that United, he would still be well regarded at United and know a lot of the people there and get a good long look.
I think if I remember correctly, he went from U17 coach to first team assistant. That's how highly regarded as just a pure coach he was by the DC United staff, by DC United front office. And now the time with Josh Wolf, even maybe developing his soccer ideas more, I think that's one that makes a ton of sense and would be really interesting and is sort of a trend we've seen where it is going younger and younger. It feels like with coaches, as you said, Losada was at the time the youngest coach when he got hired.